This is the lecture on Hong Kong and Singapore in the world economy. Let me give you an idea of what's coming up. So we'll start, this is slide 1 in the sequence. We'll start with history and background conditions, then go on to the post-war revival and takeoff of Hong Kong and Singapore. And then look at some of the policy and institutional explanations that get at Hong Kong and Singapore's success after World War II. And then finally, I'll talk about the state of play, prospects, and challenges. So moving on to slide 2 now. This is on the history and the background conditions of Hong Kong and Singapore. And the context that I want to frame both these city-states is very much a map of cities around the world going back several centuries. So one can think of European city-states such as Venice or Genoa and the cities of the Hanseatic League in medieval times. But perhaps more relevant are city-states in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia going back a few centuries. We discussed the port polities on the coastlines of India and in Southeast Asia, cities such as Cannanore and Calicut in India on the Malabar coast, and in Southeast Asia, Makassar and Malacca. Bear in mind, Malacca was very much the precursor of Singapore, going back to the 15th century or so, before the Portuguese took it over. So these were areas that were relatively lightly governed, that were religiously tolerant, that were cosmopolitan, and not least open to trade all over the oceans. That's the first point I really want to get at. Let me now talk about the founding of both Hong Kong and Singapore, starting with Singapore, which came first, and that owed very much to the vision of Stamford Raffles. Raffles was an employee of the British East India Company at a time when the British Empire was expanding. He was based in Penang, but he had this vision, as he put it, of a vast emporium of commerce, open to the world. And the place he had in mind was this little island, which was just a Malay village at the time, called Singapore. And what he undertook in 1819 was essentially a freelance operation, without asking the permission of the British East India Company, which was far away across the seas in London. He went ahead, he engineered the succession of Malay royalty in the Riyadh Sultanate, did a deal with the local Malay prince, and essentially grabbed Singapore under British rule. And that was in 1819. Singapore, in turn, paved the way for Hong Kong, because Singapore was strategically located, still is, on the Straits of Malacca. And securing the Straits of Malacca allowed the British to forge a trade route between British India and China. And what ensued over the subsequent couple of decades or so was the British export of opium from India to China, and in return the British procured tea from China, which they exported all over the world. But this was disrupted by the Chinese emperor, who banned the import of opium, which of course upset British opium traders. And they put pressure on the British government to force the Chinese to open up their market to opium again. And it was during those hostilities, in the First Opium War, that the British Navy grabbed Hong Kong Island off the coast of southern China. And the first treaty between the British and the Chinese, the Treaty of Nanjing, secured many concessions from the Chinese, including lots of treaty ports. But the main concession was the ceding of Hong Kong to British rule in 1842, I think it was. There was another Opium War, the Second Opium War, around 1860. The result of that, among other things, was the Chinese cession of Kowloon on the mainland facing Hong Kong to the British. And then in 1898, the Chinese ceded the new territories, the hinterland behind Kowloon, to the British on a 99-year lease. So there, in a nutshell, we have the founding of Hong Kong and Singapore. Now, what unfolded through the course of the 19th century and up until the Great Depression was the roaring success of both Hong Kong and Singapore as free ports. They were entrepôts, Hong Kong for the trade with China, Singapore for the trade with Southeast Asia. They were very much services-based. There was little or no manufacturing in Hong Kong or Singapore, let alone agriculture. They were, as I said, free ports. They had zero tariffs on trade. They were open to capital. They were open, not least, to immigrants, particularly southern Chinese migrant labor. They had relatively light colonial administration. And so they flourished. Until the Great Depression hit, Hong Kong and Singapore both took a big hit, an early sign that small open economies like this suffer disproportionately more when the world economy goes down. Then followed World War II, and with it brutal Japanese occupation of first Hong Kong and then of Singapore. So that gives you an idea of the background conditions. What I want to go on to now, and this is slide 3, is the post-war revival and takeoff of both Hong Kong and Singapore. And let me begin with Hong Kong. Hong Kong was devastated by war, Japanese occupation, and then it suffered another blow in 1949 when the communists took over China. And one of the first acts of Mao was to close off the Chinese economy from the rest of the world. And that essentially destroyed Hong Kong's entrepot trade. So Hong Kong had to reinvent itself. 1949 was also a big opportunity for Hong Kong because it had a huge influx of refugees from southern China, as well as capitalists, machines, skilled workers flocking to Hong Kong from Shanghai. And from the 1950s, Hong Kong reinvented itself as a manufacturing export hub. So rather like Japan at the time, with its pool of cheap labor, very cheap labor, it specialized in manufacturing for export light industrial goods such as garments and toys. And that was the beginning of Hong Kong's takeoff. Singapore had a lag of about 15 years or so before it too took off. But during the course of the late 40s and the 50s and the early 60s, Singapore was racked by instability and various crises, including lots of strikes. It joined the Malaysian Federation for a brief 2 years, during which time it actually had Malaysia's mild import substitution policies. So for that period, Singapore was not a free port. And then it had two major crises. One was the exit, the forced exit from Malaysia in 1965. Singapore was thereafter on its own. And second, there was the British announcement that they would withdraw their substantial military bases from Singapore in 1971. And the British military accounted for something like 15% of adult employment in Singapore. Now, what that did, those two dates, 65 and 71, was to really concentrate minds in Singapore, and particularly the minds of the leadership under Lee Kuan Yew. And what the Lee government did was to first take Singapore back to being a free port, and second, open up the economy to multinationals at a time when other developing countries were closing off their economies against multinationals. So Singapore actually attracted multinationals, not least in electronics, multinationals from the States and from Japan. And that was the beginning of the Singapore manufacturing for export takeoff around 1968. Now, one can think of Hong Kong and Singapore's post-war success very much in terms of stages, just as we went through for Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and stages in flying geese phenomenon. The first stage was labor-intensive manufacturing exports, such as garments and toys, and assembly electronics in Singapore. Singapore starting, of course, later, around 1968. The second phase, once real incomes caught up and productivity levels improved, was to move to capital-intensive production, just as was the case with other East Asian tigers. And that phase was roughly in the 1970s and the 1980s. So in Singapore's case, that was the transition to sectors like petrochemicals and shipbuilding. Then came the more knowledge-intensive phase, the 1980s and the 1990s, which involved a diversification into services, and in Singapore's case, higher-end manufacturing in electronics and then in pharmaceuticals, for example. And then the fourth, and the latest phase is very much about going into more higher value-added, knowledge-intensive areas, especially in services. That's overwhelmingly the case for Hong Kong. For Singapore, also a graduation to even higher-end manufacturing, areas like high-end engineering, the higher end of petrochemicals, biomedical sciences, and so on. And this last fourth phase, which I would date to the Asian crisis up to the present, is also the global city phase for Hong Kong and Singapore, because whereas they were very much metropolitan hubs, particularly with their entrepot functions from their founding, and that continues to the present. More recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, I would characterize both Hong Kong and Singapore as Asia's two global cities, in the company of London and New York, and perhaps of Dubai in the Middle East. Global cities in the sense that you have a critical mass of people here doing truly global transactions that cross boundaries, that cross jurisdictions, that cross currencies and languages, and overwhelmingly so in services, whereby Hong Kong and Singapore have become effectively the services hubs for trade within Asia and for trade, commerce between Asia and the rest of the world. As I said, this global city phenomenon is overwhelmingly a services phenomenon. So it's no accident that both Hong Kong and Singapore have become two of the leading financial centers in Asia. Hong Kong remains Asia's premier financial center, really the plug-in in financial terms between Asia and the rest of the world, alongside London and New York. Singapore, in the last decade plus, has specialized in certain niches where it has become a world leader in, for example, wealth management, foreign exchange trading, commodity trading more recently. And it's become a sort of Asian hub in other services as well. Education, casinos come to mind. And there are other areas that the government has targeted as well. So that, I hope, gives you a picture of the successive phases of Hong Kong and Singapore from the early days after World War II to the present. Now, in my slides, I have some charts which you can go through at your leisure that illustrate this flying geese phase. But let me carry on with the narrative. So I'm now moving on to slide 4, I think it is. I've talked about some of the common features between Hong Kong and Singapore. Let me now emphasize a couple of important differences between the two as they have progressed through their successive post-war phases of growth. One difference is this. This I've mentioned before. Singapore lagged Hong Kong in terms of its takeoff by about 15 years. But it caught up and overtook Hong Kong in manufacturing very quickly, in the space of about a decade. So Singapore's rather abbreviated but spectacular takeoff in manufacturing for exports was from the late 60s through the 1970s, by which time, as I said, it had caught up with and indeed overtaken Hong Kong. And Singapore remains a country, an island, with significant manufacturing capacity, and the government has consistently had that as a strategic objective. So even today, with a much more advanced economy and a particularly much more developed services economy, Singapore still has manufacturing that accounts for anywhere between 20 and 25% of GDP. Now, for a global city, that is exceptional and anomalous, because the other global cities I mentioned, London, New York, Dubai, Hong Kong, overwhelmingly specialize in services. Services is about 95% of GDP in Hong Kong, which is there or thereabouts for the other global cities as well. Manufacturing is less than 5% of GDP, compared with, as I said, about 25% in Singapore. What happened was that in 1978, when China opened up again, manufacturing shifted very quickly from Hong Kong to the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong province. And this was mainly small and medium-sized enterprises from Hong Kong shifting their manufacturing capacity across the border. And from there on, Hong Kong specialized much more in a whole variety of services, not just financial services, but other services as well, including logistics, and more recently in this global city phase for both Hong Kong and Singapore, they've both specialized in areas such as attracting multinationals to set up their regional headquarters in Hong Kong and Singapore. So those are some of the essential differences on the economic front. If we take a look at Hong Kong and Singapore today, since the Asian crisis, they've had successive crises. First the Asian crisis, then the dot-com crisis, then SARS, and then the global financial crisis. And in each crisis, what we've seen is a bigger than average downturn, because they're so much wound up with the world economy, but equally a bigger, faster rebound from these crises than the average for the world economy. And that's testament to how open they are to the world economy. Some of the charts I have show Hong Kong and Singapore, for example, have trade to GDP that's about 400%, the highest in the world. They're among the largest recipients in the world of foreign direct investment. They're both outward investors as well, particularly Hong Kong investment going into mainland China. Let me move on to the next slide. I'm skipping some charts here. And the next slide is on policy and institutional explanations for Hong Kong and Singapore's success. And I have two basic explanations to start off with. The first really concerns growth legitimacy, which is also what I mentioned with respect to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in my talk last week. Both Hong Kong and Singapore were on their knees in a state of crisis with the end of the Japanese occupation and World War II. Both desperately needed fast catch-up growth. And the ability of their governments to deliver that through the right set of policies and institutions provided them with huge growth legitimacy. So it was delivering fast growth so that people could have better livelihoods. That was the central legitimating factor for both governments. The second explanation is, as I think it is with other East Asian tigers, getting the basics right, to use the terminology of the World Bank's East Asian Miracle Report. And in the case of Hong Kong and Singapore, one can argue that they got the basics right better than all the others. Basics first in terms of macroeconomic policy. So, very conservative fiscal policy, emphasizing balanced budgets, indeed surpluses. Being conservative on expenditure, especially to avoid middle-class entitlements as they grew richer. Having low inflation, both consistently had lower than average inflation by developing country standards, and continue to have low inflation today, in other words, price stability. Stable exchange rates, another consistent feature for both city-states. Hong Kong, since 1983, has had a currency board whereby the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar at 7.7 Hong Kong dollars per US dollar. That's been fixed for over 30 years now. Singapore essentially fixes its currency to a basket, a trade-weighted basket of currencies, and the government manages a kind of semi-floating regime, and that's the essential anchor for price stability in Singapore as well. So, macroeconomic stability was very much the foundation for mobilizing savings to turn them into investment, to feed into growth. Both had and have the best business climates in the world. One of my charts, the following chart, is from the World Bank's Doing Business Index. It shows Hong Kong and Singapore at number 1 and 2. I think for last year, Singapore is number 1. Hong Kong is actually number 3 last year. And among the features of having the best business climates in the world are low and simple rates of taxation, setting up a business very quickly, very little red tape, very good judicial systems for enforcing contracts, very good trading systems with the most efficient customs operations in the world, and so on. Then comes free trade. Both Hong Kong and Singapore are free ports. They have zero tariffs. They are fully open to foreign investment. Foreigners' investments are treated in exactly the same way as local investments. That's to say, there is non-discrimination. There is full convertibility on capital account, so capital can move in and out freely. In addition to that, there's excellent hard infrastructure. There's been a consistent attention to education and skills, and so on. So those are the main features of getting the basics right. I would add one other feature where Hong Kong and Singapore do stand out. At least since the 1970s, they have both put a lot of emphasis on paying their civil servants very well. In Singapore, at the higher levels, exceptionally well, not least as a means of keeping them honest and competent and avoiding corruption. So those, I think, are two common policy and institutional explanations that go far to explaining the success of both places. Let me now come to some important differences between the two. And I would sum up these differences this way, in shorthand. Hong Kong is a much more organic sort of place. It is more bottom-up. Singapore is a more top-down socially engineered sort of place. It's much more top-down than Hong Kong. Let me explain, and I'll do so starting with Hong Kong. No country in the world has totally laissez-faire government, minimalist government that only supplies the very basics of law and order and the defense of territory. And Hong Kong is no exception. But Hong Kong is probably the closest thing there is to very light touch government in the post-war era. Now, from the early days, the British colonial authorities in Hong Kong, led by successive governors appointed by Whitehall, wanted to keep government as small as possible, having very conservative macroeconomic policy and very little intervention in the economy, and otherwise letting the Hong Kong people get on with it. And by the 1970s, one financial secretary coined a rather clumsy term, positive non-interventionism, in quotation marks, to describe this central feature of Hong Kong policy. And Hong Kong really did stand out, still stands out to a large extent, with this kind of non-interventionist set of policies. A couple of features associated with it. Hong Kong consistently has had no industrial policy. It has one or two features of very mild industrial policy since the handover to China, but before that, absolutely no discrimination in favor of this or that sector or this or that company, whether domestic or foreign. It had colonial government under the British that was largely insulated from both domestic pressure groups trying to tempt it to intervene, as well as from Whitehall. Governors were given wide leeway from Whitehall to do as they saw fit, and they moved, as I said, in something close to in something very much embodying a free market stance. The structure of the Hong Kong economy not only had tycoons who had big businesses and conglomerates, but also a wealth of small and medium-sized enterprises in manufacturing and services. Services overwhelmingly since 1978, when China opened up again. So these were some of the features in which Hong Kong really stood out and continues to stand out as far as the economy is concerned. But one should mention the political system as well, because under the British, Hong Kong had no democracy. Its leaders were appointed by Whitehall. But what Hong Kong did have, without democracy, was a liberal, open society, a free media, the freedom to assemble, to dissent, and Hong Kong had a pretty freewheeling liberal society in that respect. Now, that's not to say that Hong Kong was a totally laissez-faire society or economy, and that's a mischaracterization which some people fall into the trap of. Government was subject to the disproportionate influence of the big trading companies. Initially, the big British trading companies, as well as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and then the big Chinese business houses who came on stream from the 1980s in particular. Hong Kong has big exceptions to laissez-faire. One is housing. The government provides a lot of the housing. Over half of the Hong Kong people live in subsidized public housing. The land market is the biggest exception, probably, to free markets in Hong Kong, because the government actually owns land in Hong Kong, and it releases it for sale very conservatively because it depends for about 30% of its revenue on land. So you have astronomical land prices in Hong Kong, and the market is effectively cornered by an oligopoly of property developers, about 6 of them, and there are high barriers to entry to others. There are all kinds of domestic services where you have monopolies or duopolies in Hong Kong that are not really subject to international competition. So those are some of the major exceptions to Hong Kong as a full-blooded free market society. Let me now move to Singapore. And here again, I want to emphasize the differences with Hong Kong. Since 1959, Singapore has been, in essence, a one-party state, in the sense that one party has run the government since then, the People's Action Party, the PAP. And from the early days, the PAP went in a quite different direction to the British governors of Hong Kong. They intervened much more, and they were quite deliberate in socially engineering Singapore society to fit their vision for Singapore. So the government intervened and continues to intervene in all sorts of ways, much more so than in Hong Kong. I said that Hong Kong was not a democracy but a liberal society. Well, in Singapore, particularly from the 60s to 80s, it was the other way around. It had democracy, that's to say governments had to face up to elections every so often, and that was their source of legitimation. But Singapore became a much more illiberal society in so many ways during this period as well. The government intervened not just in the economy, but also to restrict civil liberties, the freedom of speech, and many other things besides. It was very much a nanny state government that intervened in all sorts of micro ways to goad people or even force them to change their behavior according to preset ends dictated by the government. On the economic front, some key differences with Hong Kong. The Singapore economy is an even more corporatized economy than Hong Kong's. Hong Kong has the tycoons who have their various businesses. It has multinationals, it has big international banks, but it also has, as I said before, a very thick middle of small and medium-sized enterprises. The Singapore economy is dominated by the multinational enterprises on the one side and the government-linked enterprises, state-owned enterprises, on the other side. And squeezed in the middle is a rather weak sector of small and medium-sized enterprises who were squeezed deliberately on political and economic grounds from the 1960s. And that is arguably one of the big Achilles heels of the Singapore economy, that it has a low productivity SME sector that is noticeably lacking in entrepreneurship. One other big difference between Hong Kong and Singapore, and I have a couple of charts here to illustrate the point. During their catch-up growth phases, Singapore, and I'm talking here particularly of from the 1960s to the 1980s, Singapore had much higher levels of savings and investment compared with Hong Kong, but lower levels of productivity. So they both grew at a roughly equal pace in terms of GDP and per capita income growth. But Hong Kong's growth was weighted much more towards productivity gains. Singapore's growth was weighted much more towards supercharged investment with much less productivity gains. So what the government did was to use forced savings through the CPF, the Central Provident Fund, mandatory savings, to, as I said, supercharge investment. It kept wages down, not least by controlling the union movement. And that was one key difference between Hong Kong and Singapore. Let me say a word now about industrial policy in Singapore. Again, one big difference between the two city-states. Hong Kong, as I said, had no industrial policy in terms of discriminating in favor of certain sectors and firms. Singapore, like the other East Asian tigers, had and continues to have industrial policy that is selective. But the point I would add here, this is the big qualification, is that Singapore's industrial policy was probably the softest of all the East Asian tigers bar Hong Kong. Soft in this sense. Unlike Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and then the subsequent generations of Southeast Asian tigers, Singapore did not rely on import protection or restricting access to multinationals, quite the reverse. And of course, it had its tradition as an entrepot, a free port. So what it chose were other instruments of arguably milder, less intrusive industrial policy. And they had the following components. One was various incentives, including subsidies, with multinationals in mind in particular. So Singapore had and continues to have a whole panoply of incentives, tax breaks, R&D subsidies, skills subsidies, and so on, to attract targeted multinationals in particular sectors. And then, from the 1960s, it established statutory boards like the Economic Development Board, the Jurong Town Corporation, and others besides. Some of these statutory boards subsequently became GLCs, state-owned companies, and much of the Singapore economy is dominated by these GLCs. In fact, they account for a significant chunk, I forget the actual number, of capitalization on the Singapore Stock Exchange. I'm talking, of course, of companies like Singapore Airlines, Singtel, Sembawang Corporation, Keppel Corp, and a few others. So Singapore had this kind of industrial policy, favoring the GLCs as well as multinationals, without resorting to protection and restrictions on foreign investment. And I would add one other aspect of industrial policy where Singapore has something in common with Taiwan, because from the early days there's been an emphasis on the government setting up industrial parks, providing the land and the buildings in order to attract multinationals in particular. So it started with the development of Jurong, and then Jurong Island by the Jurong Town Corporation and the EDB in the 1960s. And that policy continues. Okay, my final slide is about the state of play and the prospects and the challenges for both Hong Kong and Singapore, very much with this global city phase of their development, the most recent phase, in mind. And the first point I want to make is this. Hong Kong and Singapore are both global cities, and the logic of the global city is to adapt faster, more nimbly, more flexibly than any other place on earth. They always have to be, to use the cliche, ahead of the curve. And that involves a lot of adjustments, not least on the part of people who live in Hong Kong and Singapore. It means being extra open to the world, in having more competition in the economy than other parts of the world. That's the logic of the global city. But at the same time, and this is the dilemma, Hong Kong and Singapore, in terms of their local native populations, they're no longer immigrants. Many of them don't have the immigrant mentality of their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. They live in much more prosperous societies. And many of them have expectations that one would associate with, in quotation marks, normal countries. In other words, to have a more settled life, not to be disrupted all the time, to have to move from job to job, to expect more security, to expect the government to do more things for them. And that's arguably a contradictory logic to the logic of the global city. And I really would frame Hong Kong and Singapore's challenges today very much with that dilemma in mind, the logic of the global city versus the logic of a normal country. And of course, Hong Kong and Singapore are not normal countries. The next point I want to make is that they are now facing the challenges of a very different kind of growth. Up until the 1990s, both had highly successful catch-up growth, which was all about mobilizing investment for fast-paced growth. And that growth was accompanied, as it was in the other East Asian tigers, by considerable equity. In other words, the benefits of growth were broadly based and roughly equally shared between different segments of society, low income, middle income, and high income. And they traveled up the escalator of moving from working class to middle class, of having better education and healthcare and housing, and with rising expectations that up until, I suppose, the 1990s, the Asian crisis, were met as the decades unfolded. But what we've seen more recently, in the last decade to 15 years, is arguably something different and more troubling and more challenging. And that's the transition to considerably lower growth, predictable because they're no longer catching up. They've exhausted that potential. So growth has to rely much more on productivity gains. And that's difficult to achieve when you're closer to the frontier, as it were. So lower growth, but at the same time, much more unequal growth, because what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years is a dramatic increase, excuse me, in inequality, in income inequality, in particular, in both Hong Kong and Singapore. Excuse me. I have a couple of charts to illustrate that point. One chart, for example, shows a considerable drop in Singapore's growth over the last decade or so, while Singapore remains stuck as a relatively low productivity nation. It does really stick out if you compare Singapore to some countries in Europe and the United States in particular, because even though it has higher levels of per capita income, it still has lower productivity. It's about 70% of US productivity, for example. It's lower than it is in Hong Kong. And Singapore, in its most recent phase of growth, has relied very much on a huge influx of labor, of immigration, to keep up its levels of growth and increases in living standards. But what we've seen in Singapore is a dramatic increase in inequality. It's been even more dramatic in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has the highest Gini coefficient of any developed country, for example. And Hong Kong's differences are actually more dramatic than they are in Singapore. Since the handover in '97, median incomes in Hong Kong have declined by about 14%, I think the figure is. So a big drop. Hong Kong has close to full employment, but with successive crises, people have had to move to jobs with lower salaries in real terms. That hasn't happened in Singapore, but in Singapore, like in Hong Kong, we've seen huge benefits accrue to people in the top income segment, high-end professionals and lots of other reasonably well-educated, highly skilled professionals. But medium incomes have not been increasing the way they used to. So the middle class has been squeezed more. And incomes in real terms have actually fallen at the bottom end, in the lowest 10% to 20% of the income distribution, not least because of the influx of immigrants providing cheap labor. All of this happening at a time when, as global cities, the cost of living has increased enormously, housing in particular. So you have more discontent at the bottom and among the broad middle in both Hong Kong and Singapore. There are other concerns as well. Among the native population, society is aging fast. There are more needs to care for the elderly. In other words, more demands on healthcare, on pensions, on people providing for themselves in retirement, and so on. So all of this puts much more pressure on the governments of Hong Kong and Singapore to deliver other things and better things. And this is the kind of pressure on their political systems that they haven't faced before. So, what are the choices available for the present and the future? Well, one way to go, and this is where a lot of public pressure comes into play in both Hong Kong and Singapore, is for governments to intervene more, to redistribute, perhaps to tax more, and to spend more in areas like healthcare and pensions and social security. Hong Kong has given way to these demands to a limited extent. Singapore, which of course has a democracy which Hong Kong doesn't have, the Singapore government, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, has gone further in this direction, not least in the budget a few weeks ago, with much more resources being announced for healthcare, for providing for the elderly, and also some support for the middle class as well. Now, all of this, I think, is very much in the groove of the logic of a normal country, as I described it earlier. But as global cities, Hong Kong and Singapore have other pressures as well. And arguably moving too far in the direction of the normal country in terms of subsidies and middle-class entitlements, higher taxation and so on, might compromise Hong Kong and Singapore's competitiveness as global cities. And if there's one thing that's conspicuously lacking in both Hong Kong and Singapore, if you compare them to not just London and New York, but other really innovative cities around the world, in the West mainly, it is their lack of innovation. Hong Kong and Singapore, let me put this bluntly, are still high-end copying cities. You don't really see that much true innovation in terms of doing things differently and creatively in Hong Kong and Singapore. They're both corporatized economies. You have big companies who dominate the economies, even more so in the case of Singapore than in Hong Kong. As I mentioned before, Singapore has a low productivity SME sector. And the one thing that is lacking, arguably, in swathes of the economy, if you compare them with more innovative cities around the world, is a lack of competition. Now, true, they're free ports with free trade, and they have excellent business climates for the most part. All of that promotes competition. But because of the ways the government intervenes, for example, in the land market in Hong Kong, or with the GLCs, and through statutory boards and other aspects of industrial policy in Singapore, there are significant parts of the economy where competition is limited and where barriers to entry to startups, to SMEs, are pretty high. And arguably there's a competition agenda out there which hasn't been addressed significantly either in Hong Kong or in Singapore. Now there's a political dimension to this. Present arrangements are very nice and very comfortable for insiders. For example, the property tycoons in Hong Kong, the GLCs here in Singapore, and a whole nexus of people who enjoy both power and wealth as a result. Upsetting those political arrangements is politically very, very difficult, of course. It is easier to redistribute income by providing more expenditure to areas like healthcare and pensions, however legitimate those objectives might be. So it's not surprising to see governments go more in that direction and not in a direction of introducing much more competition into the economy. Some final points about both Hong Kong and Singapore before I close. Let me start with Hong Kong. Hong Kong's big weakness today is its hybrid political system and the quality or the lack of quality of its political elite and perhaps its business elite as well. Since the handover to China, Hong Kong has operated under the basic law agreed between the British and the Chinese. And to date, that basic law provides Hong Kong with a different regulatory system and economy to what exists on the mainland. But there is, of course, one thing that Hong Kong still does not have, and that is political democracy. The chief executive is not directly elected by the people, and the legislature is not fully directly elected by the people either. And all of this led to the big demonstrations in Hong Kong last year, Occupy Hong Kong, and Hong Kong's biggest crisis in some time, certainly since the handover. So Hong Kong has a crisis of political legitimacy. It has a leadership of civil servants who have the habit of kowtowing to Beijing, but not really taking strategic decisions for Hong Kong. The political system really doesn't seem to allow that. And its business leadership is mainly comprised of those with strong Beijing connections who are quite happy with the status quo. But in the meantime, Hong Kong people, many of them in a resurgent civil society, have been demanding other things. So there does seem to be an impasse in Hong Kong, and that impasse revolving around its political system, the unwillingness of Beijing to allow more democracy in Hong Kong, perhaps at the root of that, casts a big shadow over Hong Kong's future, not least its future as a global city. Allied to this phenomenon is, if you like, the creeping mainlandization of Hong Kong. One of the arguments that cropped up a lot during the Occupy Hong Kong protests in the last few months, this is very much a live issue in Hong Kong, is that the independence and with that the competence and the quality of Hong Kong's core institutions is now being compromised by creeping and excessive mainland influence. For example, the police force, the media, and there have been even accusations that this might infect Hong Kong's judiciary and various regulatory agencies. If that happens, then Hong Kong is indeed in deep trouble because it would seriously impair its credentials as a global city, as opposed to just another Chinese city run by the Chinese Communist Party. One aspect of this for Hong Kong is this. This is an allied dilemma, as it were. There is a clear logic for Hong Kong to integrate further with its immediate hinterland. And its immediate hinterland is Guangdong province, and that slice of the southern Chinese economy. Let's not forget Guangdong province has a population of 120 million people. It's the third largest economy of Asia if you take it on its own. So Hong Kong integrating with its hinterland, with the division of labor between them, makes eminent sense. But equally, Hong Kong is, as Hong Kong advertises itself, Asia's world city. But Hong Kong has been neglecting its international credentials since the handover, as it has relied much more on easy pickings from the growth of the mainland Chinese economy. So how can it get the best of both? Integration with the Guangdong economy and at the same time nurturing its credentials as an international or global city. Since the handover, it's done much more of one than the other. And of course, the political system is very much in the middle of this dilemma. Let me turn to Singapore. The Singapore government now has to live in a much more contested political space. It can no longer do simply as it wishes, with little consultation as it used to do. That's to say, democracy without liberalism. Singapore is moving, whether fast or slow is up for debate, to more of a normal liberal democracy. And that means the government has to be more responsive to public concerns, as well as, of course, be much more attentive to competing with opposition parties with a general election in mind. That raises a question: can the Singapore government be as effective? Can it be as strategic as it used to be in the context of more liberal democracy? It certainly has a better quality elite and more strategic thinking and strategic action than is the case with Hong Kong since the handover. But can it maintain the quality of that thinking and action given changed political circumstances? The second issue is very much how the government navigates these two logics I mentioned earlier and finds some kind of balance between the two, the logic of the global city and the logic of a normal country. And in that crucible are neuralgic issues such as immigration, housing, social welfare, healthcare, pensions, and so on. One point I should have mentioned earlier but forgot is, of course, immigration. In both Hong Kong and Singapore, there has been a backlash against foreigners, new migrants in particular. In Hong Kong, it's directed against mainland Chinese. In Singapore, with a much bigger migrant share of the population, it's been directed against low-income workers and indeed others. The government has responded to these concerns and this backlash in Singapore by tightening up some of the controls. But bear in mind that that has a cost, particularly when it comes to the competitiveness of Singapore as a global city. That's just one issue in that frame of those competing logics of global city and normal country. To conclude, back to that context of Hong Kong and Singapore as cities, very much in the line of the city-states and the port polities in centuries past. So let's think of an alternative map of the world. We are accustomed to thinking of a map of nation-states. And then it's perhaps more difficult to make the translation from city-states like Hong Kong and Singapore to nation-states around the world. But cities are actually becoming more important around the world. The world is now in the throes of its latest and most intensive phase of urbanization. of people from the countryside and small towns flocking to cities, established cities as well as establishing new cities. That's happening in Asia more than elsewhere around the world. And so as cities become more important, and as perhaps more power is devolved over time to cities, places like Hong Kong and Singapore, established city-states, also arguably become more important. And in this frame, one should think of Hong Kong and Singapore as global cities who are the services hubs for Asia that also link Asia with the wider world. That's my concluding point. Thank you.